They did not kill him quickly. They boiled him alive inch by inch in a cauldron of bubbling oil, and an entire city watched. This was the fate of Marcus Atilius Regulus, one of ancient Rome's most respected generals. Regulus had once been celebrated for his courage and honor, but those same qualities led him to a death so gruesome that it became legendary. His execution at the hands of his enemies stands as one of the most horrific punishments recorded in antiquity. As we delve into his story, you'll see how a Roman hero ended up enduring an agony beyond imagination. A decision made in the name of honor would seal his doom, unfolding into a nightmare of torture that echoed through history. To understand how Regulus came to such an end, we must go back to the mid-3rd century BC during the First Punic War. Rome and Carthage were bitter rivals fighting for dominance of the Mediterranean. Carthage, a wealthy seafaring empire in North Africa, and Rome, the rising republic in Italy, had already clashed for years in a brutal contest. In 256 BC, consul Marcus Atilius Regulus carried the war to Carthage's doorstep. He led a Roman invasion force across the sea to North Africa, determined to strike at the heart of Rome's enemy. At first, Regulus met with remarkable success. His legions won battles on Carthaginian soil. They even advanced to within sight of the city of Carthage itself. Romans believed victory was at hand. Buoyed by his string of victories, Regulus offered Carthage outrageous peace terms, essentially demanding unconditional surrender. The terms were so harsh they stunned and enraged the proud Carthaginians. Rather than submit, Carthage chose to fight to the bitter end, vowing that Rome would pay for its arrogance. Carthage soon turned the tide. The Carthaginians hired a skilled Spartan mercenary, Xanthippus, to retrain and lead their army. In 255 BC, at the Battle of Tunis, Regulus' forces were crushed. Roman soldiers were cut down in the thousands on foreign soil. The once invincible Regulus watched his army routed and slaughtered. In the aftermath, Marcus Atilius Regulus, victor of so many battles, was surrounded and captured alive. The Romans who survived were driven off, and Regulus was paraded in chains as a trophy of Carthage's victory. The great Roman general now languished as a prisoner of the very people he had tried to subjugate. For the next few years, Regulus languished in a Carthaginian dungeon as the war dragged on. In Rome, many assumed he had died. He was mourned as a fallen hero. In Carthage, however, he was very much alive, a valuable captive. By around 250 BC, after years of bloody stalemate, Carthage grew weary of the war's toll. The Carthaginians decided to use Regulus to broker a truce. They came to him with an offer. He would be sent back to Rome to negotiate a peace treaty or a prisoner exchange on Carthage's terms. In return, Regulus had to swear an oath to return to captivity in Carthage once his mission was complete. Whether or not he succeeded, it was an unexpected chance at freedom, however fleeting. Regulus was allowed to leave Carthage and see his homeland again under the promise that he'd come back. When he arrived in Rome, he walked the streets as a man out of legend. The long-lost general returned from the dead. Brought before the Roman Senate, Regulus was supposed to urge his countrymen to accept Carthage's peace deal. No doubt the Carthaginians expected he would plead for an end to the war so that he and other Roman prisoners might be saved from further suffering. But Regulus did the unthinkable. Standing in the Senate, he defied Carthage's expectations and urged Rome to reject the offer. He insisted that Rome must continue the war and refuse any dishonorable peace. He argued that Carthage was weakened and not to be trusted, that to surrender now would squander all the sacrifices already made. This was a shocking turn. Regulus was essentially advising the Senate to forsake him. His family and fellow senators were stunned. According to later accounts, they begged him to stay in Rome and not return to Carthage, to not throw his life away. Imagine the scene. His wife and children clung to him, tears in their eyes, pleading for him to remain safe at home. Here he was, free at last on Roman soil. He had only to break his oath, and he would live. But Marcus Atilius Regulus was a man of unwavering principle. He gently pulled away from his loved ones and reaffirmed his promise. Honor-bound, he told them he must return. Over the desperate protests of his family and friends, Regulus boarded a ship back to Carthage, fully aware he was sailing toward a cruel fate. When Regulus arrived back in Carthage and delivered Rome's refusal, the Carthaginians were furious. He had betrayed their hopes for peace and, in their eyes, insulted them by urging Rome to keep fighting. He had spurned the mercy they'd offered. Now he was at their mercy. Carthage's leaders decided that a quick death was too good for this Roman. They would make him suffer as few men ever have. As a lesson to Rome and vengeance for his defiance, Regulus's fate was sealed. The torments began in the darkness of a dungeon. Determined to break the proud Roman, Regulus' captors first deprived him of sleep. Day and night, whenever exhaustion forced his eyes shut, guards would jab him with spears. Hour after hour, they kept the exhausted man conscious. Before long, simply staying alive became agony. Delirium set in as the boundaries between waking and dreaming blurred. The once disciplined general was reduced to a trembling, sleep-starved wreck. But that was only the beginning of Regulus' ordeal. After days of this torment, the Carthaginians escalated their cruelty. They dragged the weakened Regulus out of his cell and into the blinding midday sun. He hadn't seen daylight in weeks. The sudden brightness must have felt like knives stabbing into his eyes. Squinting and chained, Regulus stood before his captors and a curious gathering of onlookers. Then came an act of grotesque ingenuity. A Carthaginian torturer stepped forward with a small knife. With pitiless precision, he sliced off Regulus' eyelids. In one horrifying moment, the thin folds of skin that protect the eyes were severed away. Blood trickled down Regulus' face as he realized the full horror. He could no longer close his eyes. They left Regulus to face the merciless sun, eyes forced wide open. He could not blink or shut out the light. The bright North African sun beat down, searing his unprotected eyes. The pain was unendurable. His eyes dried and cracked. Each second felt like fire boring into his skull. Witnesses say Regulus finally screamed, a raw animal sound of agony as his world dissolved into a white haze of pain. The once iron-willed Roman general writhed, utterly helpless. His captors watched coldly, satisfied at the sight of their enemy's suffering. But his tormentors were not yet satisfied. They had even more planned for Regulus's destruction. For the next phase, they devised a cruel confinement. The Carthaginians forced Regulus into a cramped wooden cage, a box barely the size of his body. Inside, the walls were studded with sharp iron spikes and nails. Once the lid was shut, Regulus was trapped standing upright. There was no room to kneel or lie. At first, he stood rigid to avoid contact with the spikes. Hours passed, and his legs trembled. Eventually, exhaustion won. His body sagged, and spikes pierced his flesh. Regulus jerked in pain, but any movement only drove the nails in deeper on the opposite side. He was caught in a nightmare trap. If he remained standing, his muscles would cramp and collapse. But if he slumped or leaned, the spikes would stab him. They left him like this, locked in the spiked box for what felt like an eternity. Every so often, a guard would jostle the box, sending the nails scraping against his raw wounds, eliciting fresh cries of pain. Blood seeped from countless punctures in his arms, legs, and back. The mighty general's body was now a pincushion of agony. One can only imagine the terror and despair that flooded Regulus' mind as he stood bleeding, blinded, and sleepless, suspended between torture and death. Yet even this was not the end of Regulus' suffering. The Carthaginians had one final act to deliver, one so horrifying that its infamy would echo for millennia. And then came the final blow. In the central square of Carthage, the Carthaginians prepared Regulus' ultimate punishment. They brought out a massive iron cauldron and filled it with oil. Underneath, they lit a great roaring fire. Word spread through the city of a terrible spectacle about to take place, and a crowd gathered under the hot sun. As flames licked the sides of the cauldron, the oil inside began to bubble and spit. Soon, a thick, shimmering heat hung in the air, and the acrid smell of hot oil wafted across the plaza. Many in the crowd watched with grim anticipation. They knew the hated Roman general would finally get his due. Others in the throng looked uneasy, whispering to each other in disbelief. Could they really be about to do this? At last, the cage was opened, and Regulus was dragged out into the blinding daylight. He was a terrifying sight. Skin bruised and punctured, eyes red and sightless, body caked in blood and sweat. The mighty consul, who had once stood proud in armor, could now barely stand at all. Yet even on the brink of death, Regulus did not beg for mercy. Half-conscious and groaning, he could nonetheless feel the wave of heat coming from that cauldron and hear the hungry crackle of the fire beneath it. The executioners hauled him up onto the platform beside the giant pot. Chains clanked as they fastened his arms and lifted his weakened body over the opening. A hush fell over the crowd. Some Carthaginians craned forward with vengeful glee. Others could hardly look at the awful scene unfolding. Then, with a signal, they began to lower Marcus Atilius Regulus into the boiling oil. The instant his feet touched the roiling liquid, a horrible hiss filled the air. Regulus's flesh began to sear and blister. An ear-splitting scream erupted from him, the first and last full-throated scream of pain. The crowd gasped at the sheer agony in his voice. The executioners, stone-faced, continued their work, slowly immersing him further into the scalding oil. They lowered him inch by inch. The oil rose past his knees and thighs, its bubbling surface popping with bits of cooking flesh. Regulus's screams turned into a raw, inhuman wail. His nerves were aflame. Every fiber of his being shrieked in pain. From the front rows, some spectators watched with savage satisfaction. Revenge at last. But many others in the square were pale and trembling, horrified by the unspeakable suffering before them. Some turned away or covered their eyes. A few wretched at the sickening smell of burning flesh that now hung in the air. As the boiling oil reached his chest, Regulus' screams began to weaken. His voice cracked from the torture. His body convulsed violently against the chains. The sizzle of his skin and the gurgling of the bubbling oil were now louder than any cries he could make. The once great general's face contorted in pain beyond imagination. Within the cauldron, his lower body was being cooked to the bone. When the oil finally rose to his neck, Regulus's head tilted back in a final spasm of agony. Moments later, mercifully, his screams fell silent. Finally, the executioners let his head slip beneath the boiling surface, silencing Marcus Atilius Regulus forever. In those last moments, the burning oil would have flooded his mouth and lungs. A final ghastly torture as he drowned in scalding liquid. Regulus was dead. His charred corpse was lifted out of the cauldron for all to see. Skin blackened and peeling, limbs horribly blistered and limp. The crowd that had demanded this punishment now fell into a stunned, eerie silence. On the platform, the twisted remains of the Roman hero hung for a moment in the air, dripping hot oil, scarcely recognizable as a human body. The deed was done. Rome's proud consul had been reduced to a horrific spectacle. For a moment, no one spoke. The brutality had been so extreme that even Carthage's citizens stood in shock. Eventually, a low murmur arose. Some in the square exhaled in grim satisfaction. Their enemy had suffered more than anyone ever had, but many were shaken. The spectacle they had witnessed would be burned into their memories forever. Regulus's gruesome end was meant as a message to Rome, but it left scars on Carthage's soul as well. The crowd dispersed quietly, the earlier cheers replaced by nervous whispers. Even the victors knew they had done something monstrous. When the news of Regulus' fate reached Rome, it was met with horror and outrage. The Roman Senate and people were aghast that one of their greatest heroes had been tortured in such a barbaric way. Mothers wept, and fathers told their children of Regulus's noble sacrifice and cruel end. Regulus was hailed as a martyr of Roman honor. His wife, Marcia, upon learning how her husband died, was said to be overcome with grief and fury. According to later Roman accounts, she took terrible revenge. 2 high-ranking Carthaginian prisoners who were being held in Rome were handed over to Regulus's family, and Marcia tortured them to death. Mirroring some of the very torments that had been inflicted on her husband, this act of vengeance, ripping out the captives' eyelids and killing them, shocked even some Romans. But many saw it as justified retribution. The cycle of cruelty had come full circle. Carthage's intention had been to send a message of terror to deter Rome from further war, but if anything, it backfired. Instead of cowing the Romans, Regulus' horrific martyrdom only ignited a deeper resolve. Roman soldiers went into battle with Regulus' name on their lips, vowing to avenge their fallen general. The First Punic War raged on for several more years, and Rome ultimately emerged victorious. Carthage's brutality did not save them. In fact, it likely steeled Rome's determination to crush their rival. In the decades that followed, Roman storytellers and historians recounted Regulus' tale as a stark example of Carthaginian cruelty. It became a legend told to school children to instill patriotism and virtue. Regulus, the man who kept his word at the cost of his life and suffered unspeakably at the hands of a cruel enemy. The story of Marcus Atilius Regulus forces us to confront both the best and worst of human nature. On one hand, Regulus symbolizes unwavering integrity and courage, a leader who chose duty and honor over his own life. On the other hand, his fate showcases the terrifying depths of cruelty that vengeance can reach. In Regulus' ordeal, we see how war can drive people to heroism and to atrocity in equal measure. His death was not a clean or noble battlefield fall, but a grotesque spectacle. Yet, it was his steadfast honor that led him there. It leaves us with difficult, haunting questions. What would you have done in Regulus's place? If you knew that returning to fulfill your promise meant torture beyond imagination, would you have the courage to do it? Would you keep your oath knowing it could lead you to a boiling cauldron? Regulus's tale is as thought-provoking as it is horrifying. It asks us about the price of principles, about how far we might go or endure for what we believe is right. His story endures precisely because it challenges us. Would we have the courage to stand by our ideals as he did, even in the face of unspeakable pain? Thank you for watching and exploring this dark chapter of history with us. How does the story of Regulus make you feel? Were you shocked, horrified, inspired, or some mix of all three? Let us know your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most chilling and fascinating tales. We have many more stories of dark history to share. And if you thought Regulus' fate was horrifying, just wait until our next episode where we uncover the gruesome legend of a man boiled alive in molten silver. Stay tuned, and until next time, stay curious and stay